late.
Yeah, welcome to daylight savings. It's the fun time of the year when we Americans decide that we want to get up an hour early uh, for some reason for a while, and then you guys do it a little bit later, which is good. While in some places, throws off a whole bunch of my meetings, and it means I have to wake up far earlier in the morning than I ever wanted to say the least. Um, to say the least. But today, I am excited for us to dive into more logic of sense. We have a good group. I'm going to go ahead and kick it off, and we can start our discussion. We're in live reading, by the way, Jack. But I'll go back and we'll reconnect with that. Um, so I'll start. Thank all of you for joining us at the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective. We are continuing into our third reading into now Paradox 2, Series 2 of Logic of Sense. This is going to be it's a hell of a read. This has been a really fun one. I've been going over this for the last week, and there's a whole bunch of different points I think I want to hit on, but I think I'll actually start this really simply by saying first, does anyone have thoughts on this section that they would like to start with after reading it? Because I know a few of you haven't had a chance. I know Alyosha's thanks to daylight savings, but oh yeah, no, I'll post a link to the let's see, great. It should be in Logic of Sense as well in the crypt pad. There's that. Come on, let's load up. Sorry, this will take me 2 seconds. Probably should start with announcements. This week we are moving to doing a handful of new things around the server. We're trying out a new scheduling system, which seems to already not be kind of what we hoped for it. But if you would check in the find reading groups in the where to start, find readings here, and click an RSVP to a handful of them, which would be great. We are doing this every week. Again, Sundays at some point, generally in the evening, I do my sit down and I read through and I do my notes. Anyone is welcome to join. We had some wonderful discussions last night, a handful of people who couldn't make it today. I hope I'm going to do right by their points as we dive into this, to say the least. I know we're doing more Nabokov in the literature group. Is that right, Jack?
Yep, we're finally getting to the Eye by Nabokov, Saturday at noon PDT.
Excellent.
PST.
Yes, PST. That's great. Any other announcements? Kent, Lou, Ben?
Zyzak and the Sex and the Failed Absolute is happening on Wednesday at noon Pacific Daylight Time.
Excellent.
The Tao Zen and Deleuze group, as always, is meeting Saturdays at 7 p.m. Pacific time. We are reading through chapter or verse 11 in the Tao Te Ching. A link will be posted later today with with the same sort of Kanban that's going to have them all on there and with some commentary for people to leave some notes on to prepare for the discussion. Look forward to seeing people there on Saturday.
Excellent.
We got Bergson on Thursday and Simondon and Foucault on Sundays for European Foucault time.
So many wonderful things happening. Excellent. All right. So today with the second series in Logic of Sense, Deleuze tackles and continues to tackle a little bit more into the world of the Stoics, as we discussed a little bit of last week. Not to recapture a little bit of what we discussed, but the focus the previous week was on the nature of becoming and sort of the paradox of what it means when an event is happening, when Alice is becoming larger, at any point is she larger, how that operates. I don't need to go too much into that because sort of the nature of this reading is actually, I think, diving significantly into that pretty much spot on. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and dive into a few of the things we discussed in the Kanban, and we will just start discussing. So there's a bunch of things I have questions about as we get going into this. So I'm hoping all of you are prepared for what has been referred to as my ignorant schoolmaster routine, because I think there's a decent amount of that inside of this. I am not an expert on the Stoics at all, but this first thing that Deleuze tackles inside of this series is the idea that first there are bodies. Only bodies exist in space, and only the present exists in time. Bodies are causes in relation to and for each other. This unity, the scope of the cosmic present, this all-encompassing T, that the existence of the bodies is sort of the totality of what they are. Please tell me where I said it wrong. But I wasn't joking. I'd love anyone want to jump in and tell me where I was off or add to that. Anyone?
Well, I must admit I don't really understand the Stoics very well, but this time when I read it, I got the idea that it's really kind of set mass type of distinction, and that the bodies are engaged in mixture, but the events are set like and discrete. So it's kind of the distinction between mass and continuity, and set like things, and uh, you know uh, discontinuity or digitization. But it's I think the Stoicism, I haven't tried to study, but I find it difficult to understand why he seizes on Stoicism.
But I think he seizes upon it for what Brooks is diving into, right? Because so when we're talking about bodies, we're now talking about causality, and we're talking about causality in chain with itself. So we don't have cause and effect, right? We have cause and cause and cause. And then, kind of at the surface of those causalities or those bodies, like Brooks was saying, we have effects. So it sets up a completely different way of thinking about cause and effect.
Yeah, that's how I read this beginning. I posted in the chat. I did a bit of a deep dive into sort of how the Stoics viewed something, which is existence, however they want to phrase it, and how they split it out into basically two things. The first thing that Deleuze is diving into is bodies, which is what we can call the corporeal, the things that actually exist. I'm doing air quotes. The the way he phrases it is only bodies exist in space and only the present exists in time. There are no causes and effects among bodies. Rather, all bodies are causes in relation and for each other. When we were talking through this last night, I was trying to make sense of it. And the way I phrased it was the way, for example, in a video game, if I'm playing a video game, Grand Theft Auto, Mario, let's take Mario, and I hit pause, and I take that snapshot and I look at it, I can say that nothing's happening. It's all that's there is bodies. It's Mario, it's the block, it's the Goomba, it's the things that are there. They're all sort of interrelated, but nothing is like an effect on each other. There's nothing happening. There's no action. It's just the things that are there. And that's his phrasing as the present. Only the present exists in time is that kind of idea of that snapshot of right now, of the things that are. Effect, necessarily, as he talked about in the first series, and he talks about in the second paragraph here, that over time, over the perception of time, looking at it from our place in the position of the present across sort of the fourth dimension, that's when we're able to see sort of that thing that the bodies cause. And the things bodies cause are effects, but effects are effectively incorporeal and sort of the surface nature of these things. They don't actually exist, but as he phrases it, they subsist or inhere. They're not substantives or adjectives, but verbs. They're neither agents nor patients, but results of actions and passions. They are impassive entities. This sort of other thing that's created, the layer of effect that we assign to what is happening amongst bodies, is that surface layer. That's kind of how I was looking at it and trying to explain sort of the difference between the two. It's not an easy thing to wrap my head around because it feels like it goes against, like flies in the face of my understanding of causality and cause and effect and things that I sort of have grown up learning. So it's a bit of a tough one for me.
The way that I was thinking about this time was that it's kind of like a precursor to the a priori, and it kind of comes about because when we look at things, the things that we're looking at are three-dimensional, but we actually just look at the surface of them, and then we see the effects, you know, um, of whatever is happening within the three-dimensional bodies. We see that on the surface of the things, and and so they've got this strict um, separation of cause and effect, whereas the cause is the three-dimensional things and whatever they're doing in their mixture and as masses, and then our vision of what's actually happening, we kind of draw the conclusion of what the effects are um, of those, and make those discrete events.
I think the reason, just think about the reason why Deleuze might write about the Stoics. I think it's given on page 8 when he says the Stoics are amateurs and inventors of paradoxes. So an amateur is someone who loves something. So the Stoics are lovers and inventors of paradoxes. So obviously, the paradox that one thing can be two things at the same time is kind of intrinsic to I would say, to Stoics. So you've got two things right at the beginning. You've got an idea of bodies, and you've got an idea of effects, which are kind of separated from each other. Normally, cause and effect will go together. So he says that the bodies exist in the present, while the effects, or I think he's going to go on to say, well, surface effects is a term in the title, are the past and the future.
No, I think that's spot on. Sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, sorry, that I lost my train of thought a little bit. I think the other thing to think is, what is the paradox that's at the core of this second, or it said the second series of paradoxes to do with surface effects. So I think, again, it's to think in terms of what are the paradoxes that are being put forward here.
But I think Ken is actually pointing out the paradox, which would be that, and like you said, normally cause and effect are kind of a straight line, right? And I think Brooks, you even mentioned this in our chat earlier, like it's baked in. But in that sense, right, you've got like a straight line from cause to effect. So like there's a sense in which we would say we see the bodies in their three-dimensionality and their corporality more so. And then we see them changing, which would be the effect. But I think the paradox is the break with that, so as to question if we do see the effects. Because if they're phantasmic, if they're expressive, and if they relate to dialectics and logicality as opposed to qualities, then in that sense, they do seem to take on that phantasma that we discussed with simulacra. So in this sense, we would be talking about For instance, like the finger being cut, right, and the act of bleeding as an event, in that sense, not in terms of the bodies themselves, because we're talking about there how the bodies are actually changing in their mixture. So blood is a body within the finger, and the way that that's now uh, changing in relation to the finger. But that change itself, right, as an effect, that would seem to be breaking from the idea of the straight line here, where the effect of bleeding is no longer a corporeal thing.
I think this is, we were talking about this last night as well, that this is one of the reasons I think it's important to not get lost in the language of like bodies and surfaces and to take it literally. Not that I think anyone's doing that, but it's very easy to look at it and think, okay, body means my body and surface means like skin, or it means the outer layer of something. But the key part about surfaces is that he repeatedly is stating that they're non-corporeal. And there there's a way, I mean, I think there might be some like linguistic play here, but I think what's important is that there's, I think, sort of like Jack's saying, by playing with this order of cause and effect, it feels very much like this Bergsonian turn to say effects precede their causes rather than the other way around. You know, so like he has this whole thing about making the event. If the event is going to be the thing that's the primary ontological sort of like reality, then it's even substance itself is a consequence of that rather than in reverse. And that kind of messes with our normal understanding of how things come to be, because you think, well, there has to be substance that in order for it to be something that changes. But if you reframe everything in terms of eventual relationships and things like that, I think it's just it's a more interesting paradoxical way of looking at it. But also just this thing about, for me, the surface thing, it really connects to a notion of the virtual, because it's not just what you look at. Like, it's not something that's self given and obvious. Just by looking at it, you understand the surface of something, because surface seems to correspond almost to the idea of sense as it comes up later. And they also refer to the Stoics refer to the soul as a body as well. So if the soul can be a body, and when we're talking about surfaces, it's a much more expansive idea of the relation surrounding a thing, in a, you know, like we're saying, in a verb form, rather than just being an already individuated full thing. It's like a whole kind of set of relationships that make it what it is. So anyway, I just wanted to offer that.
Yeah, I think that
I think what's interesting about it is that it's kind of like an alien episteme. In other words, it's really hard. You know, we're kind of set in our ways of thinking about things based on Kantianism and the idea of the a priori and the a posteriori. And this changes all the categories around in an interesting way, but it's very hard to grasp because of our, you know, kind of Kantian presuppositions.
Well, and that's why I think so the title of the book, to go back to something that I was talking about last week, the idea of the logic of sense, he's writing during a time when he was talking a great deal about good sense and common sense. And the sense he's talking about in that way is the sense of things and how things operate. And the way that he's talking about paradoxes here, and he's bringing up the Stoics as the amateurs of paradoxes who loved it, and he goes on to talk about humor and other little items, is, I mean, ultimately, I think, to sort of point out that the sense of things doesn't operate as we believe, that the nature of paradox and the reason the Stoics love it is because paradox sort of teaches us through the way it operates that things are simply what they are, that effects are perception based, direction based, time based, based on our location and our privilege over a thing. The joke I was making last night, the scalpel cuts through flesh, is something that, you know, people would say, oh, a scalpel cuts through flesh. You could just as easily say that the flesh is dulling the scalpel. The nature of cause and effect in that direction presupposes one doing a thing to another, whereas the reality is what's happening is you have essentially the bodies of the scalpel, you have the bodies of the flesh, And the new property, the effect of being cut or the split is the effect. And the effect is a secondary thing that he's talking about here.
The interesting thing about that example, for instance, is you can find the part of the body which has been cut by the scalpel, and you can find the part of the body that is about to be cut by the scalpel, but you can never find the part of the body that is being cut by the scalpel.
Well, and this feels like a very early. At this point, I think he could have said a thing like, for example, the wasp and the orchid example from later texts. This is one thing becoming another, two objects, and then we're talking about the event of one and how the bodies mix and how what they create when they do that. That's the fourth paragraph here when he talks one body withdraws from another like liquid from a vase. Mixtures in general determine quantitative and qualitative states of affairs, the dimensions of an ensemble, red of iron, green of a tree. But what we mean by to grow, to diminish, to become red, to become green, to cut, and to be cut is something entirely different. Those are no longer states of affairs, mixtures deep inside bodies, but those are incorporeal events at the surface, which are the result of said mixtures. It feels to me like he's talking essentially about our perception of bodies based on time, distance, blah, 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 things like that.
I think something that's being missed here is that what the Stoics are talking about, what he's referring to, is a system of ethics. And Deleuze is actually playing a bit of a trick here, because he's turning an ethical system into metaphysics, which the Stoics kind of did anyway, but that's like one of his favorite tricks to do. And this notion of, we'll take this first section, right? This notion of being in the present comes from an ethical background. And the reason that they view it this way is because stuff that's in the past, well, that's just part of your memories. That's not like a physical, touchable thing. And everything that happened in the past is what led to you being here now and doing the thing now. So there's no point worrying about the past. There's no point griping about the past, because you wouldn't be doing the thing you're doing now if it wasn't for the past. You wouldn't be you. And then the future is similarly abstracted, right? In that whatever's going to happen in the future is going to happen anyway. And so it's, again, like abstracted from this acting in the moment type thing. There's no point worrying about the future. Just live in the goodness of the now. And he kind of elaborates on this later when he says that the Stoics were the first, well, he quotes somebody else saying the Stoics were the first to create two types of being. I think it's funny because they wouldn't have seen it that way, but it is kind of true in that to the Stoics, life and the world in general is generally good, right? Because if you're in this position where you're asking yourself, how does one act ethically? You have the ability to rationalize. You have memories. You exist. There are a lot of good things going on. So what are you griping about? The nature of things is to be good, and that's like this almost indefectible, like inexorable force of good behind everything. And then there's this other layer of like the layer in which we actually experience things only in the present, because we can't access these things in the past. They only exist as memory. And the things in the future are just possibilities that haven't happened yet, formed by what we're about to do in the present.
So to say it another way, because I think I'm understanding what you're saying. With the Stoics, this was a lot of their writing was about the ethics of how to live life, how to make decisions, what's the good stuff. And Deleuze, like he did, for example, in AO with psychoanalysis and Guattari, his turn is to say yes, but with this assumed ethics, you've actually also got this entire metaphysics that you've kind of brought with you, and now I'm going to break that down. And having a discussion about the implications effectively of a system of ethics like the Stoics had.
Yes, yeah, and he's, I mean, to them it was a metaphysics as well, but he's making it even more of a metaphysics. He's talking about like planes of being and things like this. He also talks about Aeon, who is a particular, I would say god, but like figure of power, who's different from Socrates chronos, because chronos is like divided up time, right? Like how we would probably view time most typically. Aeon is the god of ages, the being of ages, of what Bergson would say duration. And this is the one that the Hellenistic age was most, and the Stoics were most interested in. Time was a lot less precise to them, despite them viewing everything in the present. That's kind of the paradox that they live in, right? Everything is the present, but at the same time, time is like this this complete thing, this complete chain of events that you can't break up. And so to them, there was no being as such. There was no to cut. There was like only cutting, right? Doing, going, not to go or I am.
Yeah, and that's how you get ways of being, right? Where you have the corporeality, like you're saying, this kind of sense of the present, but then you've got the phantasmic, or the sense of the events.
Well, I think they would actually say it's the other way around. They would say that the present is less real than this force of overall good behind it. But either way you want to put it, I think he's getting at the way it's structured.
Yeah, and he's doing it in opposition to Platonism, and this is a part I also struggle with. The phrasing he has when he brings up, for example, in Plato, an obscure debate was raging in the depths of things, in the depth of the earth, between that which undergoes the action of the idea and that which eludes the action, the copies and the simulacra. The echo of the debate resonated when Socrates asked, is there an idea of everything, even hair, dirt, or mud? His version of that, rather, is there something which always and obstinately escapes idea? In Plato, however, this something is never sufficiently hidden, driven back, pushed deeply into the depth of the body, or drowned in the ocean. Everything now returns to the surface. Last night, and I still struggle really understanding what he's trying to say in this paragraph and the story he's trying to tell. I get the idea of the Platonic ideal, and I've read the stories of, Socrates asking him questions to kind of, shit on his idea and make fun of it. I get that. I don't understand his connections he's making. Anyone here able to expand on that?
Yeah, perhaps I could have a go at that. Basically, the thing that's being repressed is the simulacrum, and the whole. Deleuze talks about the idea that the kind of the idea that the aim of the idea in Plato is to its ultimate aim is to repress the simulacrum, and his words, I think we talked about a little bit last week, is to keep it in a cavern at the bottom of the ocean. But he says it's now beginning to re-emerge, come back up in this kind of through the paradox, and the Stoic, what he calls that quote Stoic operation, and the notion of unlimited return. The simulacrum can make itself felt once more.
Well, it's not just felt, is it, though? The idea moves from the Platonic verticality, kind of that straight line downward and upward. It moves to the side of the effects now with the simulacra.
It does feel like that. So thank you for the explanation, Derek. That does help. Combining that with the sentences that follow, which is these are effects in the causal sense, but also sonorous, optical, or linguistic effects, and even less or much more, since they are no longer corporeal entities, but rather form the entire idea with a capital I. So is what he's saying here that the Platonic idea, the idea with a capital I, is all entirely effect and simulacra, that there is no corporeal entity to it at all?
Now, the way in which Deleuze talks about Platonism, I'm trying to think which essay it's in. I can't remember now, but basically he says that the aim of the Platonic idea is to repress the simulacrum. That's its aim, and it does this by making a judgment against those things which, what he says, participates in the ideas. So at the top of the page, the copy is a copy because it participates in the idea, whereas a simulacrum, or like I say, that's not the word that Plato would have used, but it's anyway. It gives you an idea what it means. The simulacrum can never participate in the idea, and therefore it's kind of repressed. It's completely left out. I'm trying to get the right word, but the idea is that because of this, the simulacrum will be repressed. Will be as I would say, it will be just sort of buried underground, effectively.
Well, that's interesting. So, in the end of this, and we're going to at some point have to do a reading of the Simulacrum in Ancient Philosophy, which is one of the essays included in the better versions of this book in English. He has the sentence he writes is to distinguish blah blah blah. The distinction wavers between two sorts of images. Copies are secondary possessors. They are well-founded pretenders guaranteed by resemblance. Simulacra are false pretenders, built upon a dissimilarity, implying an essential perversion or deviation. It is in this sense that Plato divides into the domain of image idols. On the one hand, there are copies icons, and on the other, there are simulacra phantasms. It's a hell of he loves flowery words. It's a lot. We are now in a better position to define the totality of motivation. It has to do with selecting among the pretenders, distinguishing good and bad copies, or rather, copies and simulacra, those well-founded and those engulfed in dissimilarity. It is a question of assuring the triumph of the copies over simulacra, of repressing simulacra, keeping them submerged, preventing them from climbing to the surface, and insinuating themselves everywhere.
Yeah, the way that I think about it is that the simulacra is kind of like an anomaly in the Platonic system, and if you concentrate on it, the Platonic system kind of deconstructs itself. And I think the feeling that I get when I read this about the Stoics is that what they did in order to try to solve that problem is that instead of having the divided line as a kind of like space in which things are differentiated, they only pay attention to the two limits of the divided line, the superrational and mixture. And so if you just pay attention to the superrational and mixture, then you get this thing where you've got the mixture which is in the bodies, right? And then superrational is when you have two things at the same time that don't interfere with each other, that are different, and so they're doing that with cause and effect in order to separate out from the mass these these events that are on the surface.
Yeah, the simulacrum, the obviously the classic analysis of the simulacrum is the sophist, and the aim there, the fundamental aim of the sophist dialogue is to prove the existence of the sophist, and by extension of the simulacrum, because they were seen to be the same. And the reason why it was necessary to kind of prove the existence of a sophist, even though the world was full of them, was that Parmenides' saying was that being is, but non-being is not. So there's no such thing as a non-being. Is to say rather than non-being is not, to say non-being is. So that was the aim. And so through that, and with that knowledge, one can then make a judgment. And what Deleuze says, one of the reasons why Plato wanted to do this is, for example, and it mirrors the structure of Athenian society at the time, in that any citizen, he gives the example of a magistrate, a position in the civic society of Athens. Any citizen could claim a post, a civic post, such as a magistrate, for example. And the question was, how do you judge that claim? And so this judging of claims is mirrored in the judging of the claim of the simulacrum. So the sophist. The sophist claims to be a philosopher like Plato, like Socrates, and whereas in the eyes of the philosopher, they are not philosophers. Therefore, there has to be some criteria on which they can be judged. But with Parmenides saying it was an impossible thing to do, so they had to get beyond that understanding. And the other thing, I'm just this section, this paradox we're looking at today, in terms of bodies and effects, what I think the effect of this thinking has is that it reverses Platonism in the fact that it allows the simulacrum to be something. In fact, on bottom of the first paragraph, page 8, he says that the Stoics discovered surface effects. So we can perhaps talk about that in a little bit, but surface effects, and which means that simulacra seems to be subterranean rebels. So that thing that's suppressed under the ground, and make most of their effects. So that's what the effect is, what they appear as. The simulacrum were the actual the name for similar. Like I say, it's a Latin term, so it wouldn't be used by Plato. But the term one of the terms is eidolon and phantasma. So things that appear to be like something, but they're actually not what they appear as. So this is the kind of idea of which the simulacrum kind of also has within it. So that
just real quick, I want to ask because I'm having trouble personally wrapping my head around it, because I'm kind of coming at it from, I think, reading this first. Do you have can I have an example of an ideal copy and a simulacrum, like a dog being the ideal? What would a copy and a simulacrum be for that, just as a question?
Well, the way in which the kind of dialogue goes is that, let's say, so basically the copy is a claimant. So what they claim is that they participate in the idea. Okay, so you have an idea, and then the claimants. So imagine that the idea is equivalent to a magistracy, a vacant post to be a magistrate in Athens. So you have an idea, and then you have to judge which is the best claimant to fill that post. Okay, and there'll be degrees of some are better than others, down to the person who's completely unsuitable, and that's a simulacrum. But the ideal, so that's a kind of practical example, but a kind of a more theoretical example. The idea, for example, the idea might be the idea of justice, for example, to do with magistrate. So who the claimant, who has the greatest claim to justice? Okay. Now, the thing that has the greatest claim to justice is justice itself. Nothing can be more just than justice. Okay, so that's the ideal claimant. But in a sense, justice is what gives out what says who conforms to being just. Okay, so it's the copy. So the copy is the one that has justness, the quality of being just, that can appeal, that can make, is the best claimant to be just. Okay, so the copy is always second. It's never the first. It's never what you might call the ideal claimant. The ideal claimant is the thing itself, the thing that is being claimed by the participants.
Right. Okay. So to use Deleuze's terms from Difference and Repetition, a few other texts, and the idea of sense, would it then be fair to say that the ideal is the good sense and the copies are the common sense? And the simulacra would be sort of that third layer that paradoxes sort of give us, or that sort of hyper non-normative understanding of things. Because it feels like a lot of this is assuming sort of a group dynamic to a social structure that assumes that there is a generalized accepted truth, that the ideal of what justice is obviously is normative at a societal level. The copies of that people would debate about would be more the common sense of it and the appeals towards that, even though it's not necessarily the good sense, which tends to apply directly to a God normative or a sort of ordained sort of belief in what's ultimately the right decision or the right ideal. It feels like there's a direct correlation between those.
Yeah, I wouldn't really I wouldn't put that layer of interpretation onto it personally. I mean, I'm sure one could make that. But I think working within what Deleuze has written about Plato, he fundamentally sees it as a kind of, he talks about Nietzsche reversing Platonism, and he says, what is the motivation for Plato? And the motivation is to make these judgments, is to make these kind of, is to say what is the acceptable, what is acceptable, what is unacceptable, and what is unacceptable will keep that completely repressed. But I think the attraction for Deleuze of the Stoics is that they bring effect. So the simulacrum is effectively a kind of effect. It gives an effect for being something. So it gives the effect of being, for example, a philosopher when it isn't. And that's one of the main reasons why, obviously, Plato, Socrates wanted to repress the simulacrum, because they said they're not philosophers. And so that's one of the reasons. But for Deleuze, the opposite. He wants to kind of advance the claim of effects. But then he does this, I think, but he follows it in this paradox. He's following in this second of the series, the Stoics, what they've done is they separate bodies and effects, so they're not together. They're not one. The body is not a cause and effect. The body is a cause, but an effect. The effects are kind of separated from them, but they meet. And I think somewhere, I think on the previous section, they meet. He says at the surface. So I think that's a really interesting idea. So it says here in that paragraph on page 8, first paragraph, the Stoics discovered surface effects. And this has the effect of, in a sense, validating the claim of the simulacrum, which Plato has spent, and it's like 2,000 years of philosophy has repressed.
Well, so the reason I make that leap is, I think, as he goes into, and he says on page 9, right following that, because I'm 100% with you on the reading, to the point where he says, becoming unlimited is maintained entirely within this inverted width. Depth is no longer a complement. Depth here, as he referred to earlier, is that of sort of the Platonic idea and the way that those layers sort of exist within an idea. He says, the crystal, where's the line? Events are like crystals. They become and grow only out of the edges or on the edge. This is indeed the first secret of the stammerer or the left-handed person, no longer to sink, but to slide the whole length in such a way that the old depth no longer exists at all, having been reduced to the opposite side of the surface. The reference here is 100% about Lewis Carroll as a person. And the reference to him, because he was a stammerer and left-handed, which at the time was, he was considered mentally deficient early parts of his life. I mean, it has to be a reference. There's no way that's not a reference to Lewis Carroll. So the reality of that, followed by the following paragraph where he says that, as a general rule, only little girls understand Stoicism. They have the sense of the event and release an incorporeal double, but it happens sometimes that the little boy is a stutterer and left-handed, and thus conquers sense as a double sense or direction of the surface. Seems to be an implication here, and it's, I mean, a hot take time maybe, The implication here is about the perspective of the people being outside of what might be called normative experience, or that of what is commonly considered, in position of patriarchal power. The little boy can't commonly do that unless the little boy also has these other things, which, as he said earlier, give him the ability to see sense as the big, large flatness rather than the depth of what is called good or common sense.
I just want to add that we also spoke about this last night, but it's important not to skip that sentence. Events are like crystals; they become and grow only out of the edges or on the edge. That is almost like a word for word cribbing directly from Simondon. And I guess just as a summary, that the idea in Simondon of what the crystal, how it can demonstrate the process of physical individuation as opposed to living individuation, is that in physical individuation, as the thing continues to individuate, I think the phrase is what is interior is anterior. I might be switching those around, but the point is that the pre-individual potentials that allow the crystal to keep growing from the original seed, it always exists at the edge of the crystal. The limit, the very edge of it, is where further individuations can happen. And so you can kind of look backwards and you can see this whole structure through that. Whereas in living individuation, there's a sort of there is an interiority from which pre-individual states can constantly be further individuated. But I think it fits into everything we're talking about, because it's another subtle move to try and look away from the idea of interiority or depth and say, well, he keeps throughout this whole section saying, you need to look at the limits, you need to look at the gaps between these propositions and events and all of this stuff in order to actually even hint at what the idea of sense could be. And yeah, for me, I think it's a powerful metaphor. I'll try and paste a quote in chat. I have some other thoughts related to causality, but I think I'll save them for now.
One thing that we ought to keep in mind is that theory and ideas are the way things look. And so, what the transition here is from the, the bodies, where, there's all kinds of things going on in it that are related to mixture. And then, but we look at it as a whole. We look at the forms as a whole and we see the way they look. And then that is where the ideation comes in. And the concern with ideation was when we make things that don't exist in nature, like tables and chairs, where does that pattern come from if it's not in nature? And that was mostly Plato's concern, was with these ideas that are not part of nature and what is their status. But that status is all caught up in the way things look, because tables and chairs look different from natural things.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most you need from Plato here is this idea of how things like take place in the dialectical relationship there, right? So with the forms, I mean, for as far as it goes, right, we're just talking about how we're going to understand being and becoming, right? There's the Platonic method, and then there's the method that Deleuze is advancing, which is the inversion of the former, right? So if we think about the philosopher, someone who's doing dialectics so as to unravel, well, basically to construct a model so as to parse what conforms to that model as the ideal, as the ideative copy, I think is what Deleuze calls it, or the idolative, versus the simulacra, which is going to be what's breaking, unless it's breaking, but what's not conforming to the model. And this is in terms of its being, right? So the simulacra shows us a way of becoming that is contesting being here, whereas the copy is showing us kind of a way of being that's falling back on being, or rather, I shouldn't say that. but that conforms to the being that's at hand, right? Because that's going to take us to the model. And so what we're basically establishing here is how the form or the idea is basically deducible and inducible, right? The philosopher finds it in these things so as to use the model to kind of move upward. And then it moves downward into this depth we're talking about, where the being can be parsed in terms of substance. Uh, the move I see Deleuze making is to say, right, so we're taking cause and effect here as basically a causality that is of the idea into the being of things, right? And that's kind of where you go from cause to effect to cause, or more so like cause to cause, right? It almost seems like he's pointing out like a kind of tautology here, cause and effect, qua causality. With Stoicism, he's moving the simulacra and the idea to effect and parsing that out between a relationship of cause in relation to cause and effect in relation to effect. And in doing that, right, and moving the idea and the simulacra to the aspect of the effect, he's able to open up a way of which the idea itself is now in a relationship with becoming that it wasn't before.
I think there's a double dance with the vocabulary that Deleuze is citing the word simulacra and he's saying goodbye to it at the same time. In the first series, he looks for where you could find becoming in Plato, and he says what would correspond to this idea of becoming is the simulacra, which elude both the model and the copy. But he doesn't even want the problematic of the model and the copy. So he looks in this second series at the Stoics, and with the quote from Breyer, he gets the idea that it's a purely and simply a result or an effect. And so on page 8, in the middle of the first paragraph, he says, it is no longer a question of simulacra which elude the ground and insinuate themselves everywhere, but rather a question of effects which manifest themselves and act in their place. In their place means not in place of the simulacra, but in their own place. But anyhow, that seems to be saying that the simulacra is a transitional term. Once you go into the depths, find the thing that it corresponds to becoming in Plato and take it out and put it on the surface. Simulacra is no longer exactly the right word, and effects is the sort of replacement concept for simulacra. So you're not really just simply reversing Platonism, because if you reverse it, it's still a binary operation where you're privileging one term. You reverse, and by so doing, the copy, the term that you have decided to give full value to is transmuted. So I think that's what he's saying. Simulacra cease to be subterranean rebels and make the most of their effects, make the most of its faire valoir in French, which means make the most of, if you're right, but means give full value to their effects. That is the effects that correspond to them. And all the old paradoxes of becoming must again take shape in a new youthfulness, transmutation. So it's inversion leading to transmutation and not just static inversion. So simulacra is the concept that permits the inversion. But once you've changed your problematic, it's advisable to use the term effect rather than simulacra.
I want to say what you just said, Terence, is very important because you're absolutely right. It's not just a simple reversal; it's an inversion. And as Foucault says, right, it's about one way of understanding logic of sense is that the inversion of Platonism is a departure from Platonism through Platonism. So it would be a mistake to make the simulacra the new idea, right? That would be the reverse on a switch of just you're reversing the terms, but you've still got the same basic construction. It's just now becoming becomes a kind of being, right? So it's a whole new problem in that sense. But I think you're spot on there because like even Foucault, right? He's not going to say simulacra. He's going to say phantasm, because this inversion allows us to depart from Platonism insofar as an autocritique, right? When we start working with conceptuality or like this ontology and dialectics, what Deleuze has done is this is basically going to be kind of like a line of escape, right? There's a velocity which, through the autocritique, instead of taking us into that movement up and down that I was speaking of earlier, the Deleuze has allowed us to actually like propel out of that.
Yeah, I don't think there's any sense that he wants to replace one idea with another. So in other words, replace the idea with the simulacrum. I don't think there's any sense of that. I think,
He
in
says
fact,
it. He says it. It is no longer a question of simulacra, but rather a question of effects.
Yeah, because, well, that doesn't say, but that doesn't say, well, the effect is what's at the surface. So he's got this thing between bodies and the effect at the surface effect. And he's not saying, we're not appealing to the simulacrum as an idea that we look to see how things participate in the simulacrum. It doesn't make sense for him for the idea that somehow the simulacrum is just another idea, but like somehow the opposite. I don't think that's what's being said here. I mean, I've just referred to the quote of I can't remember what it is now, but the notion of we don't want to appeal to the big other, some other overriding intelligence that will somehow inform of us of the way the world is. Because I think that if that's what the idea is, so if you're just replacing the idea of the simulacrum, then you're just replacing one universal intelligence with another.
I think that's if you use simulacra, that you've got the model and the copy, and you look in Plato for something different, and simulacra is it. It can be elevated, but unfortunately, it still has all the connotations as the simulation, likeness etymologically contains. And because he's undoing the binary opposition of Platonism, he takes this term, because you need a transition, and then it's like once the boat takes you to the other side, you can let go of the boat. You can still keep it on your side. You don't have to push it away. But it seems to me that he's saying there that the more important term, the most purified of Platonism, is effect rather than simulacra. But that's how it seems to me, but I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. But the simulacrum is an effect. I mean, it is.
Yes, I agree.
That's how it functions.
I'd like to just try to clarify this relationship between the idea and the copy. That in Plato's concept of ideas, that the copies, there's a twofold relationship between the copy and the idea. One is that the copy participates in the idea, and the other is ousia, that the idea manifests itself in the copy. So there's like a twofold relationship between the copy and the idea, and the essence is what mediates that participation, or that ousia, that presencing between the two. So just to try to clarify what is the relationship between copies and ideas, I thought I'd just mention that.
That actually squares really nicely too with the Stoic development that Deleuze is making, where you have like, because you get, again, we're going back into like different ways of talking about cause and effect, right? So like this is kind of that good sense again, where good and common sense, right? Where there's like a telos, right? And the cause and effect is always toward that, is always mediated through that, like you said, that essence, right? And that's kind of the direction you're moving in. The Stoic element here gives us something different that breaks with that, right? Where that manifestation is effect, and that's where idea and simulacra are, or phantasm, whatever word we want to use here. And the bodies being on the other side, their bodily interaction being a series of causes, the unity of which we would call like destiny. Yeah, that being parsed out in its relationship to a unity of effects, as opposed to like cause and effect qua cause.
I think this is why some of the actually Deleuze himself in the 5th series brings up Bergson, where he says, as Bergson said, one does not proceed from sounds to images and from images to sense. Rather, one is established from the outset within sense. And I think this thing that we're getting at, we're circling around the use of cause and effect and the simulacrum and stuff. I think what's so fascinating about this text is that it's pushing for, there's a way of doing philosophy, and that is often critiqued in these like thinkers of difference, that, as we've said, is all about trying to figure out how can you understand the true interiority of things, or their essence, or their adherence to the idea, or whatever it might be. But there's a fascinating, like I said, speaking of Bergson, which I'm always going to be repping, there's a fascinating bit that we're on right now in Matter and Memory, where this is exactly kind of the issue. He's like, if you take something like feeling or affect, as we tend to think of it and understand it, it's sort of something that we're like, oh, this kind of, we think of something, we observe something, we have a feeling, and it occurs to us, and it kind of emerges ex nihilo out of nowhere, and then we apply it to a thing in the world. But his move is to kind of say, well, it's not exactly how it works, that the way that we participate in images is his way of talking about things. It's just his turn, I guess, is that the affect is actually localizable. It's not something that comes out of nowhere. It actually it begins on a surface in the way that the sense data is received by us, and then kind of through the way that that gets converted, it's basically the our bodies, that surface that we experience from what he calls the zone of indetermination, is the virtual link between quantitative and qualitative multiplicities. The reason I'm bringing all this up is not to confuse the Deleuze stuff, but just to say that, that what that means is then that what's happening at that surface, that moment of contact or endosmosis, as Bergson will call it, isn't somehow secondary or anything. It's actually where affect begins. So rather than what we tend to do when we're like, oh, well, so I had a motivation, and then I wanted to do this, and then I saw this, and I felt this, and that is what led to this action. He's like, causes, as we understand them, causes only emerge after the fact, after this localized surface level effect becomes distributed throughout a system, and there's further effects. We can then point backwards and say, oh, this was the cause of that, in this kind of abstracted notion. But that's not really how things are happen or experienced. So that's obviously a more specific to, I'm talking about affect there, but what I really like about all this is this paying attention to the limit. The limit point is not a margin of something that you don't need to pay attention to. That's actually where everything occurs. And if you are lost in looking for essences and interiorities, I don't think it's that it's not real. I think what's brilliant about what Deleuze is doing is that it actually, you are describing something. You are describing things that are happening. It's just that if you equate that with like all of metaphysics, and then you think what you're describing is the essence of things, then you're kind of falling into these paralogisms of hylomorphism and all the other stuff. But if you can accept that what you're doing is playing on surfaces, then all the really interesting work begins, because then you can start to expose the strange contradictions of that, I guess.
I wonder if we could look at the section on language, because I think it's a good bridge between the kind of philosophical text to the kind of the literary one to do with Lewis Carroll. So at the bottom of page 8, that's a paragraph at the bottom of page 8, and he talks about the Stoics. So the Stoics use the paradox in a completely new manner, both as an instrument for the analysis of language and as a mean of synthesizing events. So there's this use of language to create events, to bring events about, and also to kind of analyze language. And I think in the next page there is a quote at the middle of in the same paragraph, and he talks about Chrysippus taught if you say something, it passes through your lips. So if you say chariot, a chariot passes through your lips. So this is using language to create a paradox. But I also think it's about the structure of language as well. The language, what is the relationship between the proposition and the thing that's being spoken? So it's on two levels, I would say.
No, I would agree with that for sure. The example right before that he brings up of the Sorites, the Sorites paradox is one of the really fun ones. I think a lot of us may have used a different version of when we were little, but it's as he calls it, a series of interrogative propositions which, following becoming, proceed through successive additions and retrenchments. That's how a paradox works. The Sorites is the idea that I have 1,000 grains of sand. I have a heap of sand. If I remove one, I still have a heap of sand. If I remove one, I still have a heap of sand. If I do this 1,000 times, I end up with one grain. I still therefore have a heap of sand. So one grain is a heap, basically, is the sort of wordplay there and the paradox that is part of that. And it's the way that language utilizes our sense of things and the way we understand them to sort of play into itself. It's what Lewis Carroll does. It's what he talked about in the previous one, but the Sorites is like a perfect example of it, because it's like, I think the original version is like 1,000,000 grains of sand. So it has 1,000,000 million little things you have to do. It's how does he place it? This 1,000,000 series of prepositions that proceed until you get to the moment. And so I think it's a really nice example of that.
Yeah, and he's excuse me, and he brings humor is something that happens at the surface level. So he's talking here. It's the kind of literalness, the literalness of what's being spoken gives us the paradox. And he says humor is the art of the surface, which opposed the old irony, the art of depth. And so he's contrasting humor, which is this paradoxical statement, with the use of irony, which is obviously a Socratic method, the use of irony. So those two are kind of contrasted with each other. So, sorry, it says in the next paragraph, Sophists and cynics already made humor a philosophical weapon against Socratic irony. But with the Stoics, humor found its dialectics. So it's a kind of its expression, its way of kind of analyzing the dialectic, I think, makes appear what it speaks about in a kind of very clear manner. And he says, and he goes on to the next paragraph. Lewis Carroll carries out this operation inaugurated by the Stoics, or he takes it up again. So you can see this link now between the kind of ideas that Deleuze deals with, the notion, kind of ideas of difference, the notions of surface, they're kind of anti-represent. I'm trying to think of one easy way of saying it. They're kind of anti-representation, of his philosophy, and its kind of connection now into the work of Lewis Carroll, and his use of paradox at the surface.
Well, so the use of it in the next paragraph, though, is where I tend to think that what he's talking about is essentially that all ideas is effects, that they no longer have the what is the term he uses for it? I'm sorry, I'm just a little off on this one. One sec, go back to my notes. Bodies. That bodies and effects, ideas are only effects, not bodies, because it starts with him talking about how early in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, she's going through the depths of things. She's diving into the sort of Platonic ideas of things to investigate them, to try to understand the reality of stuff. As the story goes on, she slowly begins to see things only as the surface, which is actually where the things actually exist as they slide along. The nature of sense being those pure surfaces rather than the depths, which are just the objects, and we can't really say more. I see it as kind of that difference. I don't know. Is it? I was talking a little bit more about this last night. Oh, 61, you're here. Welcome. But I think this, like that's I tend to think that that's kind of the implication he's making, that, as he says, with language, all of this is only the effects, is only the simulacra, effects in the causal sense, but also sonorous, optical, and linguistic, since they are no longer corporeal entities, but rather form the entire idea. So, to reverse that, the idea is entirely made of non-corporeal entities. That would imply that they are only effects.
Sorry, where is that last bit?
Bottom of 7, paragraph 7, where it says, these are effects. It's like the last 3 sentences on that page right before phantasms. These are effects in the causal sense, but also sonorous, optical, or linguistic, even less and much more, since they are no longer corporeal entities, but rather form the entire idea. I mean, it's very specific where he says that. And so, like, the commentary I see him making here is that what was eluding the idea was the fact that our generalized sense of things in the larger social structures, which is what sense implies upon, and especially the Platonic ideal insists upon, the accepted normative ideal of a thing, the opposition to that is actually the effects, the things that they produce. And if we're able to actually only talk about the things that they produce, and we remove the bodies, the states of affairs from it, that's actually where that's where talking comes from. That's where words, that's what we're talking about right now. And then that's what's actually coming back to the surface. That's the incorporeal limit, and represents now all possible ideality, the latter being stripped of causal and spiritual efficacy. So it feels like he's removing causation entirely from events, that they are effects wholly, and that bodies are causes that refer to themselves. Which is it feels like a gigantic inversion of kind of how I understood things to work prior to maybe a year ago, for sure, but for sure a reversion of sort of the classical, what I would call good and common sense of the way that language and things function in our societies. I'm trying not to bring in a lot of this as I'm reading it, and it just feels like if we've been reading some Guattari's work that's contemporaneous to this, actually, in another reading that we're doing, and it feels like this is early Deleuze prior to like slamming into Guattari at full speed, And like my peanut butter got in your chocolate gets in my peanut butter, and out comes machinic semiotics and the body without organs out the other side. Like this is just kind of feels like a very, I don't want to say early version of it. I would say a more poetic version, but it feels that's really the implication here, that the ideas and how we talk about things and what can actually be discussed, the way that we utilize language is that of the Platonic ideal followed by copies, where we talk about the normative structure of the words we use, which in itself insists upon a cause and effect that is already in place. When I say, for example, I am a man, that's the end of my sentence, that in and of itself is similar to almost an infinitive verb because of how it is used inside of good sense and common sense within the Platonic ideas. When in reality, if we take apart the body and the effects, we say on the one side, sure, there's the body. I'm a dude with a penis or whatever. That's the way it works. On the other side, I've got like all of the other effects that are the way that I am as a body slamming into other bodies and the things that's produced. Those would be the signs, the asignifying signs that sort of are expressed and that we place together in order to actually be able to have conversations at a large scale. That feels like this is that early version of that. I may be taking it too far, but like a lot of this really feels to me like it's right in that direction. And it's the line, this is indeed the first secret of the stammerer or the left-handed person, no longer to sink, but to slide the whole length in such a way that the old depth no longer exists at all, having been reduced to the opposite side of the surface. I mean, that is talking about the nature of someone who is absolutely in their own way non-normative as a left-handed person, especially in the time, and a stammerer, especially in the time. It was not thought that stammerers simply had a speech impediment. They were stupid. They lacked sense. I mean, they talked about it in those forms. And so someone who's in that position essentially is forced by their social structure to move sideways and to deal with things along the surface as they start to realize that the way that people talk about these ideas may not be the overall normative. The normative way people discuss these things may not be the actual way these things affect the real world. And it feels like he's saying that again when he talks about boys have too much depth, a false depth, and at that false wisdom and animality. The male baby in Alice is transformed into a pig. This took me a little bit to break apart, but it's specifically in relation. It happens sometimes that a little boy is a stutterer and left-handed and thus conquers sense as the double sense or direction of the surface. This is talking about sort of those who are emboldened and bought into the normative standards of sense, the good sense and common sense of the time, which tend to be how we discuss things, versus those who actually have sort of that secondary, view of reality and are able to see effects for what they are, not that they are built into the idea of things, but that substance and bodies is not the same thing as effects.
I think what excuse me, one of the things I think that's interesting in this just the section you're just reading from, and just referring back to the quote from Emile Brelier, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, but he talks about planes, Planes, which I know is a kind of important aspect of Deleuze's thinking. I'm just slightly vague on this, but if we go in that paragraph on page 9, the second paragraph which starts Lewis Carroll, and he's instead of talking about, he's talking against depth, and he's talking about width. So I think in this, what he's doing, he's setting up a kind of a structure which is a flat structure, which kind of ties into his use of the notion of, I think is it planes of immanence? I'm not sure. I'm slightly vague on that, but I think he used it in at least one of his books, this notion of a plane of immanence, and And I think here there is this structuring of the way in which we understand the world as a flat plane which has width but no depth.
Well, I mean, the paucity of death is that, like, so normally you're digging down for qualities, right? So you're digging down for the redness of a, I can't say pickle, that pickles aren't red. The redness of a tomato. There we go. Right. And so you're digging down into the tomato to find the redness, to find the circularity of it, right? But if that's all if that's all a question of the bodyality, the corporality rather, you lose that depth altogether, right? And so you like you're saying, you get that plane or you get that surface where the bodies are at, yeah. And with that surface, we've got to bring in the other side, which is the phantasm or the mist that he talks about in relation to Alice, right? So the reason I think Deleuze is calling it like a false depth is because you're looking for what's kind of superficial within, right? You're going into the tomato to find like the being of the tomato in terms of like the essence of red and all that, and to ask what is it, what does it mean in that sense? How does it take it upward in like a deductive or a dialectical sense? Yeah. But if it's just simply a question of mixtures of bodies, right? The reason it seems kind of hollow, not to be too T.S. Eliot here, is because those qualities are just mixtures of bodies, right? There's not really a lot of depth to go. And so at that point, because you're at the surface of bodily interaction, bodily mixture, and at the limit of fate in that sense, to be kind of dramatic about it, you can start to deal with the effects at that surface, which are going to be your expressions and your manifestations in that sense, right?
I like that. And I think his reference to science here, where he talks about science being also that of the surface. God, where was that? I want to get the right exact quote. Where was that? Sorry. Oh yeah. If there is nothing to see behind the curtain, it is because everything is visible, or rather, all possible science is along the length of the curtain, because there's nothing behind it. The way I read that is that as we're able to talk about things and assign sort of bodies to stuff, it creates bodies, but the surface is actually where the causal thing. When we talk about the mixtures of bodies, the way bodies mix and they collide inside of a mixed drink or a meal you cook or whatever, or inside of Brooks, who's Brooksing all the time. We can define all of those bodies, but the surface, the effects, is where they connect and where things are produced. And that thing that is produced is effectively what we are talking about. That the ideas are the effects. I'd say I keep going back to that. I feel like he's almost turning Plato completely on his head with the idea that ideas are wholly just effects, that they're not bodies. Like feels like he's diving into that, and I can't get away from it in my head.
But you want to be a little bit careful though, because it's not like he's not trying to say ideas are BS, right? He's getting at more like we might say that with the collection of causes and their unity being fate, right? We might then say that effects in this sense, or like the phantasm events, or like if we go back to the simulacra, right? If we collect all those, we might actually get the idea. But then we've got an idea not linked to models and being. We've got an idea linked wholly through becomings and phantasmic ones in that sense.
Yes, no, I don't want to make the assumption that I'm not saying events then become secondary to bodies or at all. Like I'm not privileging or shitting on effects. I'm more saying his argument, I think, is that Plato's idealism and the way that the Platonic ideal works is it does privilege form. I mean, obviously it privileges form, but that with it becomes an assumed series of cause and effects within each of those ideas. And that is sort of privileging and layering depth. And his argument is essentially removed that. No, it's the bodies and along the surface. That's the effects. This is what we're actually dealing with. Not in a bad way. Sorry,
Yeah.
sorry, Terrence, I saw you were jumping in.
I think
Sorry. Go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I don't think he's talking about ideas. He says ideality. So it's this thing that it depends what you mean, but what you understand by that term. But I'm trying to think of what it means. But I think that it can refer to something.
I mean, he uses idea multiple times capitalized.
Yeah, but he says represents now all possible ideality. Yeah, the later, I think, and he said it's now it's without. I'm trying to find it. Sorry, spirituality. I think the word. Oh yeah, it's stripped of its cause and spiritual efficacy. So, doesn't have that kind of otherworldly role that the Platonic idea has, and it doesn't bring. It's not responsible for bringing about things, as we might understand them in the world. And I think its reference, I would take it. The idea, so in a sense, it's not. I think it's completely not Platonic. The notion of the idea that he's dealing with. So it's how an effect can say something, and the going back to the Stoic discovery of surface. So on page 10 in that paragraph, Paul Valéry had a profound idea, which is what is most deep is the skin. So the idea that the surface, because the idea is about something beyond, something kind of way beyond. It's not of the world. It's an abstract. It's something abstract. Whereas I think this is very much a kind of thinking of, as we've said, of bodies and the relationship to the effects that they give. How they do this, and it is this kind of width. It has no depth. It has just width. It just goes from left to right.
I wonder if it's also like we said earlier about this. What is it that the something eludes the idea? And we were talking about the simulacrum, but there's a point in the text where I will try and find the exact citation, but where he explicitly says that it's what if in the pure event, what is eluded is the present. And I think it's because of this thing of causality, because it's sort of, to be able to make a proposition in the first place, to be able to think or do philosophy or do any of these things, to become, like, everything has to always be in an evental relationship, at least in Deleuze's language. So if that is the primary thing, then the problem with like a Platonic idea of form, or like strictly reified hylomorphism or whatever, is that it's like the assumed, it's like the problem with, it's sort of similar to the problem with sense. There's an unspoken of ground that makes this possible, but because it can't countenance that, it has to come up with all these contortions to kind of expel that and explain why it seems as though things are coming ex nihilo. There's all these kind of different explanations and ways of combining bodies, the Kleinemann, which actually comes up in this section. But if you can accept that there is sort of this endless ontological priorness, that of evental relations, that is always like further back in the chain, and you can't actually point to the beginning point, then it's like, I think what Jack was saying, that we're not saying that the idea isn't real, but it resituates what form is in terms of its relationship with virtualities and actualities. It's like we keep saying, it's an observation that isn't just intellectual, but is the word that 61 and I were trying to work out last night from Simondon. It's like allegmatic, transductive. It's information or knowledge that actually is topological and not just noetic. It doesn't just make random observations about the world. It actually is partaking of them in a particular way. It's just one facet of them. And if you ignore their duration or mobility or the evental relationship of the whole state, then you kind of, this is when you start falling into all these problems.
I want to make sure Terrence gets he's always polite and lets other people talk. Terrence, you got the floor.
Well, what I meant to say was in relation to the passage you read a while back now about if there is nothing to see behind the curtain, it is because everything is visible. And I don't know if anyone mentioned that in the chat because I can't follow both. That seems to be an allusion to an example that Lacan takes of the competition between the two Greek painters to paint the perfect picture. And one painted, I don't know, an apple on a tree that seemed so perfect. And when he came to see the others, it was hidden by a curtain. So he said, draw aside the curtain so I can see your picture at last. And the curtain was the picture. But it was so perfectly done, it seemed to be hiding something, but it wasn't hiding anything. Has anyone seen this example before?
I'm Googling it right now.
I don't know which seminar it's in.
This is this is the Pliny the Elder story. I know this story because I drink Pliny the Elder is one of my favorite beers. That's not useful, but it's accurate why I know it.
So it seems to be a rapid allusion to that.
Yes, it's Paratius.
Conflating it with sorry, go ahead.
No, Paratius and Zeuxis walk to Paratius' studio, whereupon Paratius asks Zeuxis to draw aside a curtain and witness his own masterpiece. When Zeuxis attempted to do so, he realized the curtain was not a curtain, but a painting of a curtain. Oh, I am now surpassed. Paratius is better than me, Zeuxis said. It's I'm gonna anglicize the shit out of this. I apologize. Nope, not gonna try it. Not even gonna try it. Trompe-l'oeil, thank you.
It means to deceive the eye. I mean, it's interesting this because in this sense, the winner of the competition is the one who makes the perfect simulacrum.
Yes.
And yet art is
Plato
not
or
is
for
opposite of that.
Deleuze?
No, he's talking about the competition because the curtain competition was in response to Flip the Two Guys. One went, look at how good my painting is. I painted grapes so good that, oh God, forgive me if I'm wrong. The birds tried to eat my grapes. That's how good my fucking drawing is as I drew these. And he goes, oh, let me show you my picture, and took him to his place. He's like, look at this thing. And then he goes to take the curtain back. He's like, haha, got you. You fooled birds. I fooled you. That means I'm a better painter. It's kind of the short version. And so when they're talking about like the competition of who's better at simulacra, that's what that is. Sorry, I didn't mean to overstep. Terrence, please continue.
No, that was just one thing. It's sort of uniting that anecdote with Nietzsche's idea that there's nothing behind the veil of illusion, and you must be satisfied with the veil or the curtain. So he doesn't give any reference; he just says it really rapidly. But all of the text is like that. The other thing is he's sort of trying to create a new language within the language, make the ordinary philosophical language say things that it doesn't usually say. So that's why I feel there is a sort of play on simulacra versus event, and he's sort of saying that the word simulacra is transitional to effect. And suddenly we see him talk about dialectics, which is usually a swear word later on, but he gives a positive sense to. And at the bottom of page 9, I've been a bit confused when you give page references. It seems that my pages are not the same as yours, but on mine, the bottom paragraph of page 9 begins with Lewis Carroll carries out this operation. And towards the end of that paragraph at the bottom of page 9, sort of a third from the end, in my text, it says, depth is no longer a complement, and it should be an I. In my copy, it has I've got a paperback or whatever, or a soft cover. It has complement with an E, which doesn't make sense. So depth is no longer a complement. So he's revising the vocabulary of ordinary language, but also academic language. Oh, that's deep. For him now, deep is the less good quality. It's not exactly a swear word, but it could be.
No, it's the following sentence: only animals are deep, and they are not the noblest for that. Deleuze, famously in the ABCs of Deleuze, did not speak complimentary of animals. We'll say. So, yeah, for him to say, "Oh, depth, how good for you," is kind of the joke. Oh, yes, you're quite deep. Good for you.
Which is why later when he quotes Valéry, and he said Valéry had a profound idea or a deep idea, it's a backhanded compliment. I think in ABC, Claire Panet quotes his thing about the deepest, what is most deep is the skin, and Deleuze jokes that should be on the front door of dermatologists. And yeah, so there's this idea of creating a language within the language, looking inside the language for what words can convey the new problematic, as if the Platonist problematic has totally regimented the meanings that we give to our words, and you're working against the grain to get out a different sort of meaning.
I do want to make sure we get a chance to talk about a few things that are at the end of this. The last paragraph, here the barometer neither rises nor falls, but goes lengthwise, sideways, gives a horizontal weather, talking about kind of the world of Sylvian Bruno and Through the Looking Glass. The line at the very end where he talks about the technique of passing from reality to dream, from bodies to incorporeal, is multiplied, completely renewed and carried out to perfection. It is, however, still by skirting the surface, or the border, the one passes to the other side. By virtue of the strip, the continuity between reverse and right side replaces all the levels of depth, and the surface effects in one and the same event, which would hold for all events, bring to language becoming and its paradoxes. It feels like this is kind of following the stuff we've been talking about. I would love if anyone could break this apart, because this last paragraph I've had a very difficult time kind of breaking out and trying to get at exactly what he's saying here. Unless it's just following more of the same and him expanding on it, which that makes sense. It just feels like he's trying to say something added, and I can't quite make it.
I would say that the part of it is taking already known problematics and finding something in them that expresses the becoming, the event, the effect, the surface, but has not fully emerged within them. I just want to make a little footnote that here Deleuze talks explicitly about the Möbius strip and following things around and getting inverted and so on, that Zizek makes so much of in Sex and the Fad Absolute. But the feeling I got there, because I thought, aha, finally Deleuze talks about the dream and says something positive about it. But I get the feeling that this passage is in a way against the surrealists, because we know that Deleuze didn't like the ordinary surrealists, Breton and company. He liked the marginal surrealists, Artaud and Bataille, and I don't know who else. And so the surrealist technique and why they liked Lewis Carroll was this passage from reality to dream. But for Deleuze, that's just an inversion. And the key element for him, he's saying here, is the surface, which is the transition element. So I think the reversal is good for Deleuze. You're getting outside of the primacy of official reality, but just going to the other side is staying within the same problematic, the same ideological setup of terms. You're not transforming them. And he's saying that it's the surface or the border or the frontier which contains the key to all these passages.
Yeah, and in the section you've just quoted from Brooks, so he talks about reality to dream, and from bodies to the corporeal, and I take bodies obviously is what that refers back to the beginning of this text, this section, and the incorporeal are the effects. So he's kind of the bodies are the reality, and the dream is the incorporeal. But it's about this skirt. It's about the resisting the depth. It's about skirting the surface of the border. And I think and it's this one passes aside by virtue of the strip. So I take it that is that reference to the movie Strip. That strange kind of paradoxical thing that kind of I find it difficult to explain what it does, but I can understand it. I can see it, but I can't explain it. Oh, the continuity being reversed and right side. I think that's probably what that says. The next sentence replaces all the levels of depth and the surface effects in one and the same event. So the Mobius strip is an event.
Yeah, Mobius strip. When you cut a Mobius strip, it has one side. Like that's the one surface is basically the idea, and it's a fun little gimmick thing.
Yeah, it's continuous, but it can go inside and outside. Is that right? So it has a reverse side, but it is actually the same side or something. But then the last sentence, as Carroll says in an article, playing superficiality as a character of speech, and I think that takes us on to the next part of the next text. The third series, I suspect, will continue that thought about playing superficiality and the character of speech.
All right. I think I have to think about all of that, but thank you both. Does anyone have questions about this paradox, this grouping, these 12 paragraphs that are just incredibly dense? There's a lot in there. So if anyone has questions or comments, now would be the time to speak. We're getting about 10 minutes away from finishing up, so now would be the time.
I wonder if anyone can put into words what is the paradox of surface effects?
Well, again, it's the break with cause and effect, like particularly in terms of causality itself, right? So what the Stoics give us is instead of taking cause into the effect as its own direction, right, and perhaps even lead us into a problem of like putting the two under the heading of causality. I'm thinking that instead we get causality and effect. We get rather a unity of causes and a unity of effects that are basically, they're almost parallel with each other, except insofar as effects are the expression of those bodies, right? So we get this series of chains, but their relationship is through expression. So it's events are taking place through effect into effect into effect, in the same way that bodies are interacting with each other, and the expression of that bodily interaction is going to be in the effect, which sets up a dialectics of effects or phantasms, as opposed to like a dialectics of how does how does digging into what a tomato is lead us to better understand the idea through the construction of a better model.
I don't know the answer. I'm just one thought I've just had is because a paradox has that one thing that can do two things, and I wonder if it's referring to surface. So the surface, it's at the surface. It's an effect at the surface, and it kind of goes in one direction and another. So it goes across the surface. So it's so on page 10, I'm just looking. Well, it says by following the border, by skirting the surface, the one passes from bodies to the incorporeal.
Maybe it's not an accident then that Lewis Carroll, it's through the looking glass. The mirror is often the archetypal example of that kind of paradox, that this thing which appears to be real, which you nonetheless cannot touch, and all the kind of speculation about what happens when you're looking at the mirror, what are you actually seeing and what are you experiencing. I mean, that seems to be the metaphor Carroll is working with. I wonder if that could be helpful.
Yeah, I wonder if that, going back to that sentence of Chrysippus, that the idea of chariot, if you say chariot, then the chariot passes through your lips. That is a surface effect, so that it's a literalness, a superficiality of language. And so the surface is on the surface, so it's the kind of effect at the limit where it meets the body, but it's also superficial on the surface in that sense as well. So it's not deep, it's superficial, and it has an effect. The effect is the chariot passing through the lips.
Well, and in the mirror example as well, what you're really talking about is light being stopped and not being able to go through this dense material. So it's some of its virtual potentials are being realized in a way that normally you don't see because light just passes through things. So for what to us looks as though we are miraculating ourselves into the frame or whatever is also just an effect of this other process. So that's why I think in that Bergson quote I put, he's said it's as though one were to fancy in seeing his reflection in the mirror in front of him that he touched it and stayed behind it. That's kind of like what often happens with these paralogisms in philosophy and stuff.
I think actually it's a fair question. So let's say it again. The first series paradox is about the nature of becoming and how becoming sort of presupposes the way that we're talking about a thing through time, even though we're making a statement about the present, a snapshot. But it is an assumption of a verb and an infinitive, which implies growth and action, which isn't possible inside of a single snapshot of time. It's the first paradox, becoming. What is the second series paradox? The paradox of surface effects. What is the paradox of surface effects? It's a fair question, actually. I'm trying to figure out how I might phrase it, and I don't know if I can.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, from this discussion, I think it is that idea, for me, it is the idea that in language where things are spoken are taken literally for what is said. So normally in, let's say, in Platonic philosophy, there's a kind of notion of the what's underlying something. When you say something, what's underlying that expression? When you express something, what's underlying it? Whereas with the surface expression, you have to take it literally. You can't say what is underlying this. So, for example, if you say, again, going back to that kind of quote, if you say something pass through your lips, so if you say chariot pass through your lips, so you might approach that in a kind of more in-depth manner, in saying, look for a kind of, let's say, a semiotic analysis or something. The chariot represents something. I don't know what, So, but it's taking it absolutely literally. And it is a paradox. So the paradox is that a chariot can pass through your lips. That is the paradox. So it has two things. It has, or does it? It has the meaning and the effect. The meaning is you saying something, and the effect is the literalness of the thing itself passing through your lips. So I think we need to look for two, because it's a paradox. I must always look for the two elements of the one thing.
Well, the reason that the Chrysippus thing is a paradox is if we assume that the language is speaking towards the physical reality of a chariot, where at first the first sentence is if you say something, it passes through your lips. The joke there is something is a thing you might say, is a word, is an idea, is a concept. But if we say chariot, well, then a chariot is the something that passes through your lips. Ha ha ha, I've been clever, I've used wordplay. Might be tossed aside as like nonsense on its face. But I think Deleuze, like with the first paragraph, is inverting that and saying, actually, all of it is actually events and all of it is surface. It's not that chariot, as we're saying it in the first part, is surface, and then later we're talking about a real one. All of it is surface. That's why this is actually almost, I don't want to say like, that's why, since all of it is surface, all of it is making commentary.
Yeah, I would read that slightly differently, because I think, again, if you look at the sentence, if you say something, so something for the Greeks was a thing, something, it was a thing, it was an actual thing. So if you say something, so we have the idea, so that one term can be two things. The thing it refers to, and sorry, I'm trying to think this one through a little bit, and perhaps in the word it's and the thing. No, sorry, but I think
something in that first part is. I'm going to try to use terrible wording. Something is bodied, like that something in, as it's said inside of the Platonic concepts of how ideation works and ideas work. If you say something, it passes through your lips. It's the ideation assuming that there is a thing there, that there is substance behind it, a body. If you say chariot, which is the joke, is now I'm saying something that is purely incorporeal, then a real body will pass through your lips. So it's, to say another way, if you say body, it passes through your lips. If you say body, a body passes through your lips. Then no, all of it is actually pure event and surface. And that's why it's like, that's his commentary. I think that it's the paradox is revealing the reality of stuff. The paradox is that we don't have objects, obviously, or bodies, states of affairs passing through our lips. We only have incorporeal effects passing through our lips.
Isn't this basically just getting to the notion of sense that is going to be like kind of the purpose of this book? Because I think the idea of like, oh well, no, this isn't a real chariot, that's a real chariot. But like, you know, the example, there's a good article by John Brady, I think, that talks about this, of like, you give someone a grocery list and you're like, okay, buy me tomatoes, and then you're like, can you imagine someone calling and being like, all right, I'm looking at 300 tomatoes, which one do you mean? Like, well, there's like, this is the whole point of this, that whether you're talking about a supposedly real chariot that you can point at or draw or indicate to someone, or it's the word out in the ether, either way, there's always sense. There's always this like, there's always a given eventual relationship that you're not articulating. And so in a way, I mean, I don't know where he's going to go with that, but I imagine that he's saying in a way that that's the paradox, is that they're actually, these two operations are not that different. Just because something's in front of you and you're also speaking about it doesn't mean that sense isn't in operation. And these are just, you know, the classical categories: denotation, manifestation, whatever those three categories are. This is okay, this is a clear linguistic relationship, and everything else is just speculative. Like you're saying, everything relies on this, that empty square or whatever that's always eluding us.
I think classically, usually, you know, like Zeno's paradox, you try to resolve to prove the movement is possible, or the catching up with the turtle is possible. Classically, you would say here it's a problem of the distinction between use and mention of a word. When you use the word, you're using it to designate something else, something in the outside world. When you mention the word, you're putting it in quotation marks, and you're treating the word as a sort of entity in itself. So if you say something referentially, it's not the same as when you say something sort of citationally, and you get a paradox when you sort of make a short circuit between both. The two classic examples that come to mind, one is like Chrysippus. It's Korzybski in General Semantics. I don't know if it was him, I think it was his disciple Hayakawa, who would hold up a matchbox and in class and say, "What's this?" And people would say, "It's a matchbox." And he'd throw it at them and say, "Matchbox is just a noise. Does this look like a noise? Does this feel like a noise?" That sort of a pseudo Zen approach. Another approach, a more creative approach, maybe, is in Philip K. Dick's early stories. There's one from, I can't remember when, 1953, something like that, called The Eyes Have It. And there's this guy who picks up a book in the bus, and he suddenly discovers that there are aliens amongst us, because he reads in the book, I gave him my hand, but he rejected it. His eyes roved around the room. So imagine people who had detachable organs, and I forget group minds, because they are. I forget the metaphorical expression for they're all of the same opinion, and that was a creative technique. Here, the paradox is pretty static. Chrysippus says that, and we don't know what he did with it. There's no context, but it could be a creative formula. So I think the way Philip K. Dick exploited the idea of taking these sorts of expressions. If you say something, it passes through your lips. Taking that sort of thing that we can say without thinking about literally in this first published story, I think, is putting on display what the science fiction perception is, that words and collocations of words can be taken literally, and that produces a whole new type of thinking and literature. So I would say in certain contexts, a chariot does pass through your lips, but it will be with a bard who sort of makes the chariot live with a striking description of the chariot, and not just saying the word chariot. You're mainly in a referential context when you use nouns in particular.
I like that. And I think with that, I think we're going to go ahead and actually end it. That was a really, thank you for that, Derek. Derek, thank all of you for joining today. I'm going to, once again tonight, be watching for a new CryptPad to pop up, a new link, and a new PDF. We're going to move into the third series of paradoxes. I believe this one is called The Proposition, which is also going to be a bit longer of one. I think it'll be about the same length of discussion, but it's a lot more to actually read. So we will get through it as we do. Thank all of you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Okay, thanks a lot, everyone. Bye-bye.